time you want. Richard Hobbs, today's speaker, is the executive director and a co-founder of Human Agenda. Currently, he also serves as the moderator of Santa Clara County Move to Amend and a principal in the law office of Richard Hobbs, focusing on immigrant rights. Richard previously served as the director of the Office of Human Relations of Santa Clara County and as a trustee for the San Jose Evergreen Community College District for 16 years. A former Peace Corps volunteer in Afghanistan and Ecuador, he has lived, worked, made presentations, or studied in over 40 countries, including making a presentation to members of the Gross National Happiness Commission of Bhutan in 2011. Richard has a master's degree from the Autonomous National University of Mexico and San Jose State University, and a Juris Doctor from Golden Gate University in San Francisco. Please give a warm welcome to Richard Hobbs.
Thank you for that nice intro.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. It's always a great pleasure to be here at the Humanist House. I've been here many times, and I always enjoy whenever I come here. I have a topic today that, of course, is of great interest to all of us, and that is how people are responding to our current administration. And I'm going to be talking about 3 different levels of response. But first, there is a handout, actually, that can guide you in terms of the remarks that I'm going to make. And I think that will be helpful to you. You can take this away and have the more or less summation of what I'm going to say in one single page. So I want to start just by talking about the United States of America, because we're always known as the nation of American exceptionalism. And I want to talk about some of those exceptional characteristics and qualities of the United States of America. First of all, of the 28 or so industrialized nations on planet Earth, we have the highest inequality of any one of those. We have the lowest taxes, the greatest border inequality between any 2 countries on Earth, actually, in terms of per capita income. We have the biggest military budget. We have the most military bases. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was at the Democracy Convention in Minnesota, and Jill Stein, who ran for president on the Green Party, mentioned that now we have over 1,000 military bases around the world, and the rest of the world combined has 35 outside of their countries. So it's over 1,000 to 35. Are we empire or are we not? So it's pretty clear that the scope of our economic system has expanded and encompasses the entire world. We also have the highest incarceration rate and the most prisons of any of the advanced countries, the most weapons per capita, the most expensive elections by far. We also have no health care for all. All other advanced countries have some form of socialized medicine. We also have no paid family leave. We're the only country that has no federal paid family leave. We're also the only country that has no employer-required sick leave. So there is no federal law that requires employers to require giving them sick leave to their employees. There is no employer-required vacation time. This is up to the employer whether or not they give employees vacation. There is no mandate at the federal level, as opposed to all of the other countries that are considered quote-unquote advanced countries. We also have the lowest corporate tax rate, the highest child poverty rate, and we almost have the longest hours of work of any country. We're not at the very top, but we're very close to the top of the countries that have the longest hours of work. And I wanted to just give an example of the impact of that. I serve on a national group called Take Back Your Time that looks at work-life balance. And about 8 years ago, locally, we had a workshop on the issue of work-life balance, and a local family law judge, Catherine Lucero, on the panel mentioned that here in Silicon Valley, the biggest single asset that is divided during marital dissolution proceedings is unused vacation time. So the typical case is the software engineer who's working like 70 hours a week and doesn't know his wife, doesn't know his children, and after 10 or 12 years, they don't take vacation. He has all of this accumulated unused vacation that has a monetary value. And at that point, when they go to dissolution proceedings, because we live in a community property state, half goes to the husband and half goes to the wife. And so it's pretty interesting that we live in a society, in a local community in Silicon Valley, where the long hours, not only of the higher paid, but especially, I think, of the lower paid, that have to work 2 and 3 jobs just to pay their rent, is creating enormous alienation. And that's why we get very few people. I mean, most people are doing their laundry right now. They're not here because they don't have enough time to do the simple things in life. And that's driving a lot of alienation, people that really don't even socialize outside of their workplace and their family, if that. I might also add to this American exceptionalism that we have the worst president on planet Earth. So I wanted to talk about 3 levels of what I see going on in response to Donald Trump's election. And I'm going to call them responding to what's going on, trying to create reforms in terms of what's going on, and then trying to basically revolutionize our political and economic system. So I'm going to talk about those 3 levels. And I'm going to start with the moral dimension because you may have heard that there's going to be 1,000 ministers gathering in Washington, D.C. And they're basically creating a moral alternative to Donald Trump. And I don't need to explain the values of Donald Trump. I think we have seen them expressed again and again throughout his life and throughout his presidency. And so I would say on a moral level, and actually on pretty much every level, that a large number of Americans are responding with outrage. They really don't know how to respond. There aren't channels to respond. And so if there is a channel like a demonstration, then a lot of people are joining them, including what happened yesterday in San Francisco. And what has happened a lot there have been more demonstrations in the last 6 months than I've seen probably in the last 10 years of my life. So that's just outrage. It's people, going into the streets, sometimes not knowing what to do, but wanting to do something to express themselves. And that's good. We all need a catharsis. And that's what I think the vast majority of Americans who are responding to Trump are doing. They're doing that cathartic response to values that they don't accept. I have to say I see a second level of values which are very powerful, and those are the values of caring and love. And I think the word love and caring and compassion are put out there by a number of congregations and churches and religious institutions. And I think that does clearly create an alternative to Donald Trump's lack of caring and lack of love for especially the most oppressed in the United States. And that is a very significant response. However, I have to say that when we talk about caring and love and even social justice, without really understanding what the content of that is that could create an alternative society that would really institutionalize love, that we, in essence, are creating a vessel without any significant bearing. And so here I want to talk about a third level of morality. And as you can see, I've called them decks, and we've really thought through these values a lot in Human Agenda. And we call these values democracy, equality, cooperation, kindness, and sustainability. So there are many values. You know, honesty is obviously fundamental to any value, for example, that you talk about. But I think it's different to talk about social justice or love in general than to actually begin to create alternative institutions that incorporate equality and don't accept the dominant institutions of our society. Recently, I was at a San Jose State human rights class, and I asked the students if they knew about ESC, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which actually the United States was a signatory to that human rights document. And none of them had heard about it. This was at the beginning of the class. Hopefully they would learn about it. But I basically said in the United States we have a different ESC. Our economic system is built upon the exploitation of human beings. Our financial system is built upon speculation. And our political system is built upon corruption. So even though people in general think, a lot of people I think in the United States believe that we are number one in the world for a number of reasons, I believe that when we look at the morality of the United States and the dominant institutions, that unfortunately most Americans have internalized what is completely legal in the United States of America, and that is exploitation, speculation, and corruption. It's all legal. It's part of our system, and we think it's part of everyday life, and we accept it, and we don't challenge it. And that's our problem. So the second level I want to talk about here is the political dimension. We've had an outpouring of different new organizations that have formed and launched ever since this administration came into being. Two examples, for example, are the Women's March that was downtown, and throughout the country, of course. In Washington, D.C., it was huge. And the Indivisible movement is another example. Another example that I think is a little bit more on the third level of revolutionizing is a new group called the Incorruptibles. The Incorruptibles now have 48 chapters around the United States, and their goal is to elect candidates that are corporate-free, that refuse to take corporate contributions. That's one of the bases, and that are accountable to their constituents and that have values that we care about. I'm going to talk more about that a little later. But once again, I think in the political dimension, we've seen outrage or basically just a cathartic response as the primary form of responding to the Trump administration. But then we also have, I think, a large number of people, especially Democrats, that are saying, if only, and there's a lot of if-onlys, right? If only Russia had not intervened, if only Comey had not done what he did, if only. And so there are a number of if-only scenarios, and then Hillary would be in power and everything would be perfect.
Yeah, right.
So there are a large number of people that believe that. And even people who go beyond that, I would say, and focus more on the Bernie campaign. And by the way, next September 9th, Cornel West is going to be interviewing Bernie to find out what his intentions are in terms of creating an independent third party. Because there's over 50,000 signatures that have gone to Bernie, and they've said, Bernie, we think we need something outside the Democratic Party, and can you be that leader? Which would create an entirely different landscape in the United States, a different political landscape if that were to happen.
Where will that interview be?
In Washington, D.C.
Will it be broadcast?
I can probably get the link and get it to everyone. Yes, it will be broadcast. So the third level is more like the incorruptible level, which I think politics in the United States have to be completely revolutionized. We know that Citizens United in 2010 allowed corporations to give unlimited amounts of money anonymously to candidates. And the Supreme Court said that is no corrupting influence to allow multinational corporations to give unlimited amounts of money. So we also have a little judicial problem in our country called the Supreme Court of the United States. But with that understanding that our political system is entirely corrupted at this point, we need to begin to use the model, I believe, of the incorruptibles, which is actually modeled after the Richmond Progressive Alliance, which began in 2005. Gail Richmond was the first person elected to the Richmond Progressive Alliance, and now they have 5 of the 7 city council people that are part of the Richmond Progressive Alliance. And as soon as Donald Trump won, a number of us who had been working on progressive election issues met, and we decided we had to do something different in Santa Clara County. And so we began working on what is called the South Bay Progressive Alliance. It's really pretty much mimicking the Richmond Progressive Alliance in many aspects. But the South Bay Progressive Alliance now has bylaws and a mission statement. And the goal, of course, is to elect local candidates who refuse to take corporate donations, who will sign a pledge of accountability that they will meet with their constituents on a regular basis. And third, that have values that everyone in this room cares about. So we want to know their values too on a number of social issues, political issues, economic issues. And so I will just let you know that the South Bay Progressive Alliance is going to launch on Sunday, October 1st at the Roosevelt Center here at 19th and Santa Clara Street. And Gail McLaughlin, who was the first person to be elected on the Richmond Progressive Alliance City Council, will be our guest speaker. She is now running for lieutenant governor and also refusing to take any corporate money as she runs for lieutenant governor. Good luck, right? When you get to that level, it's very difficult without money. But somebody has to break through, and she's trying to do it, and we need to support her. So I just want to say that locally also there is a political response, I think, guided by these values. In fact, these values are written into the South Bay Progressive Alliance in a little bit different terminology, but that we're trying to create institutions, including local political institutions, that are democratic, egalitarian, cooperative, kind, and sustainable. And those are the kinds of values we expect to see in candidates. And we want to also run campaigns to promote candidates also. For example, the districted elections in the city of Santa Clara, or allowing undocumented immigrants to vote in school elections in the Alum Rock School District. So those are some of the things that we're also considering, ordinances, not just candidates. The third level I wanted to talk about is the social dimension. And I'm just going to use 2 examples here. One is what was announced yesterday, really, by Donald Trump in terms of transgender in the military. And so the immediate reaction, I think, was outrage, especially to those transgender individuals who are in the military. And, of course, the reform angle would be to allow transgender people to join the military, which is exactly what Donald Trump has just issued an executive order to prevent. However, if we really think about, do we want anybody in the military, I think we would take a more structural point of view. The fact that about half of our money as taxpayers goes to the military right now, and we have a military budget that's pretty much comparable to the rest of the world combined. So we would instead, I believe, try to restructure the military and create a military that has defensive capacity and not the offensive capacity that is the result of 1,000 bases around the world and projecting our military power as an empire. The other example that I'm very familiar with respect to immigrants, there have been innumerable rallies and forms of outrage at Donald Trump's remarks way back from when all Mexicans were rapists and criminals, all the way up to today. This past 2 days ago, an announcement was made that Donald Trump will make a decision about DACA. So he has always supported deferred action for childhood arrivals. That was the one exception that we saw during his post-election administration. But now he is seriously thinking about taking away work authorization and some form of protection to 800,000 young people who came into the country when they were 3 years old or 5 years old, who had no bearing whatsoever on making a decision to come into this country without legal papers. And so we're anticipating this coming week to have a huge outcry. Well, an outcry is happening right now. But with respect to immigration, I've actually been part of immigration reform since the last true legalization, which was in 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act. I wrote a white paper on the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986 to make it more generous, to try to make it more generous. But for the last 40 years, what we've seen is a number of groups trying to allow, especially the 11 million undocumented immigrants, to at least have work authorization and hopefully a path to a green card and then to citizenship. However, most of those reforms, of course, have died. In 2013, the Senate actually passed an immigration reform, which was not a good immigration reform. And then the Speaker of the House did not consider immigration for 1 year, and it died, and that was the last attempt to do anything in terms of reforming the immigration system. So in my opinion, the more radical or revolutionary response to immigration would be to really look at the conditions in the home countries. I lived in Mexico for 5 years, and I remember in 1993, I was part of the Central Labor Council as part of the teachers union. And we were trying to convince a guy that the airport is named after, Norman Netta, that he should not support NAFTA. And we were unsuccessful. NAFTA was approved. And in the case of 10 to 14 million independent commodity producers, corn growers, Mexicans who grew corn and were able to make a living from their corn, they were thrown off their land because they could no longer compete. With the signing of NAFTA, there was no longer a protective tariff that Mexico could place on U.S. corn, and as a result, number one, we have the most productive corn growing on earth. I'm actually from the state of Missouri. I've seen those big combines. Number two, we have the most subsidized corn on earth. We pay $6 to $10 billion a year to the agribusiness to grow corn. And number three, with the removal of the protective tariff, it meant that Mexico, which was the birthplace of corn, Mesoamerica, became all of a sudden flooded with this cheap U.S. genetically modified corn. The same corn that the European Union has outlawed. They don't allow genetically modified corn, but it's okay to ship it to Mexico. And so as a result, 10 to 14 million people in Mexico no longer had a livelihood. And that created a mass exodus in terms of immigration. About half of the people went to the major cities in Mexico, like around Guadalajara, Monterrey, the border in Mexico City, and about the other half came to the United States of America looking for a job to feed their children. And so these policies have driven a lot of the the negative impacts on our society. And so if instead Mexico had control of its own economy, which it does not, then Mexicans would stay in Mexico, which is what every Mexican would love to do, to stay in their home country, in their home culture, with their home family, in their home community, just like we all do. We don't necessarily want to all of a sudden go and live in, some foreign country, but they can't because they have to feed their children and they have to feed themselves. And so we need, new trade policies. We need to allow Mexican. There's an author who wrote a book called When Corporations Rule the World, David Corton, who was in the Peace Corps for about 35, he worked for USAID for 30 years or so, including in Nicaragua and the Philippines. And after studying the whole international aid system, he said, it's much better if the United States does not give aid to foreign countries. What foreign countries need is they need to allow local people to control local resources and their local political systems. That's the true way that people can stay in their home country and develop their economic and political systems. But that, of course, is not happening today. In terms of the economic dimension, just to take one example of Obamacare, I think there's been a huge fight to save Obamacare. And a lot of people have fought to save Obamacare in an uncritical way. Just Obamacare is better, let's save it and keep it. So that's a kind of a response reaction, right? Just saying it's better, so keep it. And then there are other people who say, no, we need to tweak it, including some Republicans and a lot of Democrats. They recognize the imperfections of Obamacare, and so they're working hard to make Obamacare a little bit more workable under our current economic system. The other more revolutionary and more systemic approach, of course, is to create an entirely new system, which is what SB 562 in California is all about, which is not going forward, to create a Medicare for all, and to allow our entire healthcare system to be a single-payer system whereby everybody can get any kind of healthcare benefit immediately without question, just like the other 27 industrialized nations have right now, but for the United States of America. Another example is financial institutions. I think a lot of people think that we need to, for example, take what's the name of the bank that recently was thank you. So Wells Fargo, take Wells Fargo and flush it down the toilet, right? Because of what they did, creating 2 million bank accounts behind the backs of individuals. And so people think that, well, we just need to work on reforming our current banking system through small changes like that. Other people take more of a reform approach, more structural reform in terms of the divisions within our financial system, and also, for example, promoting credit unions, for example. And then I think there's a different level, and it's been going on in North Dakota since 1911, and that's to create a public bank. Last December, when Senator Jim Bell spoke at the Human Agenda Human Rights Banquet, he said that he was in favor of creating a California public bank so that we could all bank at a public bank, and that interest would go to serving the needs of Californians that need help, and not where our money is going right now, to basically enrich the rich. So another example is I put pizza as an example because obviously we have pizza chains and they make a lot of money. And we recently had 2 pizzerias in Santa Clara County that formed cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives. And it's called A Slice of New York. And there's one in Sunnyvale, and there's one on Stevens Creek in San Jose. And so the former employees now have become worker owners, which means, of course, that they make all democratic decisions about their workplace, that they share the profit. It's called patronage when it's a cooperative. They share the patronage. There isn't one person that gets all the profit or a couple that is a typical pizza place. And so it's something that's happening right here in our local community. Another example of that is Teamworks, which is 20 undocumented immigrant women in Sunnyvale who are cleaning homes, and they have exactly the same format. They are meeting monthly to make all decisions regarding the cooperative, and they are dividing the patronage. And of course, as co-op members, they're having to learn all of those aspects that are necessary to become a good co-op member, which means how to read a balance sheet, how to run a meeting, how to participate in a meeting, what does consensus mean, all of these skill sets that most Americans have no knowledge of. And so it's part of the movement to grow cooperatives. In Human Agenda, we have created a co-op development fund. So we have thousands of dollars in that fund. We're trying to support the creation of cooperatives. Because once again, if you take the multinational corporation and you ask, is it democratic, egalitarian, cooperative, kind, and sustainable? I think you'll agree that you'll laugh. But if we take a worker-owned cooperative and we ask, is it democratic? Yes. Is it egalitarian? Yes. Is it cooperative? Yes, by its very nature. Is it kind? Yes, because people learn how to work together. And is it sustainable? Yes, because workers don't make decisions that are going to harm them, which is what a lot of large corporations do. They don't care about the health and safety of their employees. And so this is one example of a more institutional, systemic level of resistance by creating alternative economic institutions, which really is, I hope, the future of the United States. If we don't move in that direction, we will continue to be victims of those three values that I just mentioned, of exploitation, speculation, and corruption, unless we make some fundamental changes in our country. So, as is mentioned at the bottom of page 1 here, we need a clear vision, and that vision has to meet our basic human needs in the pursuit of happiness on a healthy planet. And if you turn over the page that you have, I just want to quickly go through some of the work that Human Agenda has done over the last 15 years. We have interviewed over 70 different groups, and we've asked them, what are your human needs? And so this is what people have responded. In terms of individual needs, they have physiological needs and psychological needs. And the other slide here has to do with social needs. And this is where I want to focus a few minutes of attention. So we believe in Human Agenda that a vision that incorporates the needs of individuals into a division of labor of society where people's individual needs can be met through different human need fulfilling activities that are institutionalized into institutions that meet those needs, which is not happening now, is the way forward. And so I'm going to talk about 5 areas. First is care work. Care of the self, that means taking care of your individual needs. That means having the time and the resources to take care of yourself. Not that software engineer who was working 70 hours. He didn't have time to go to the gym. He didn't have time to talk to his wife. We don't need that. In terms of care work, it's also fundamental that men do as much as women in the home. And as Juliet Shore pointed out many years ago, women do 19 more hours of work per week at home than men. And that's fundamentally unfair. That has to change. There are policies, like in the Netherlands, that give 2 years of paternity leave to fathers, for example, where a policies can make a difference. They can allow men to participate more, for example, in the care of younger children. But we don't have any of those policies in the United States. We don't even have paid family leave for anybody as a national policy. So we are way behind in terms of social policies in the United States of America. The second one is labor. I think it's important that everyone participate in those human need fulfilling activities that actually produce something of value for society, either through production or through services. And here's the list of services that were identified by these 70 different groups. The one that just recently got added under labor and services is actually care work. Because at the Democracy Convention, there was a big discussion about whether or not care work should be something that is unpaid labor, which actually care work, education, autonomy, or democratic engagement, and self-realization, the others, are all unpaid labor. And the only paid labor that, at least right now, in terms of where we think the history of the world can take us, at this time in the United States, we think probably people still need to get paid to do their labor. There may be a time in the future where payments are no longer necessary. But at this point, I think it would be a huge transition, for example, to go to basic income only, which is also on the table. A lot of people are thinking about a basic income system where there was no work requirement. Now, Ro Khanna, interestingly enough, is against that, and I agree with Ro Khanna on that point. I do believe that if you have basic income without a work requirement, that in essence, we are devaluing to some extent the need to reproduce our economy and our society in a way that is necessary. So if you'll notice here under labor, we think that production of necessary goods and services at a living wage with reduced work hours is fundamental. And I really want to emphasize reduced work hours because, as we know, with automation and also exploitation, we have a ton of people who either don't have access to work or are working very long hours. And so if everyone had access to work and were doing something of value, meaningful work for society, either providing a service or producing a good, then all of us would be working a lot less. I don't know if you know, but in 1930, the US Senate passed a 30-hour work week. It didn't get to the House of Representatives, but there have been times in our history where there have been proposals to lower the work week to 30 hours or less. And actually right now there are Nordic countries that are experimenting with the 30-hour work week. The third area is education, and this area is important that we have access to continual education throughout our lives, and with reliable information is a big issue. So it can't just be education, but it has to be education with reliable information, and that's one of the major points of the Humanist Association, is we need to do this through science and not through Trump. The fourth area is autonomy, which really is autonomy in terms of local people having autonomy over their own communities, especially if they have their own language and culture, for example. But primarily this has to do with democratic decision-making. What in Venezuela is called protagonism. Protagonism means involvement. Involvement in the institutions that affect our lives. It's engagement. It's not about going to the polls and once every 4 years casting a ballot. It has nothing to do with that at all. It has to do with, in your neighborhood, if you want to improve your neighborhood, is there a neighborhood association where you can get involved and improve your neighborhood? It's at your workplace. Do you really have a say? Because under our capitalist system, with owners and unions, even with unions, workers don't really have a say. The managers are the ones that really call the shots. And so participatory decision-making means starting with the family and going all the way up to the United Nations. We have very many undemocratic families, autocratic families. So we can start with the basic unit, the family, and say, are we really being, engaging each other, man and, husband and wife in a democratic way or not? There's a lot of families that are not structured that way. But it also has to do with those major institutions in our lives, including our neighborhood, our workplace, our local government, and all the way up. We have to find ways that people can participate in a meaningful way in all of the institutions that affect their lives. Now, all is a lot, and so you may want to think about this in a way that is a few. But if we actually were to engage in a few institutions, we would be doing so much more than we're doing in the United States today. Because most people are not engaged in anything, in any meaningful group that makes decisions that affect their lives. And the final aspect here, the realization, was at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization or self-realization. We need the time and the institutional support to be able to do the things that make us fully human. To do the things we really care about, the things that give us passion, we need time to do those things. But in addition to do those things, we also need to do care work. We need to take care of our children, our elderly. We also need to work and contribute to society. We also need to have access to education throughout our lives and be engaged in education and learning. And we also need to be involved in participatory decision-making in institutions. So it's not just about this issue of self-actualization. It's about creating a society where our basic human needs can be met because we have institutions that are supporting those human needs. And we don't have those institutions today in the United States of America. Our corporate culture, our financial culture, our political culture are not supporting the meeting of these needs, especially because of the lack of time. Time is a huge element, and I honestly believe that there are pretty much every single person in the United States is separated in a meaningful way from one of these basic human needs that has been identified here. In Silicon Valley, I mean, everybody knows that a lot of 7,400 people lack homes in Santa Clara County. So there are 7,400 homeless. That's a human need. And without that human need being met, it's very difficult to do the rest. I recently helped a homeless woman. Her name is Kelly Ann. She was kind of staggering along on Bird Avenue. And I took her out to have some food at Denny's. We talked for a couple hours. She said, in her own experience, being homeless for 4 years because she lost her home in Milpitas, that the vast majority of the homeless don't start using drugs or alcohol, but they wind up there because of their situation. A lot of them wind up there because of their situation. But at any rate, we have a responsibility to provide her with work and with income and with a home, and we're not doing that in Santa Clara County. Another example is our transportation system. I mean, gridlock is taking people sometimes to be commuting up to 5 hours a day because the only home they can really afford is in Modesto. And so that imbalance that is created by having to be in the car 5 hours a day means they don't have time to do these other things. They're not going to the gym. They're not probably talking to their kids or even reading to their kids at night. They're exhausted. And they're probably getting home, after bedtime. And so these are fundamental things that are creating alienation among almost every single person in the United States is suffering some form of alienation because they don't have access to one or more of these needs, including transportation and housing. So I have about 10 minutes left, and I just want to talk a little bit about alternatives once again. And if you see the second to the last slide, once again, These values, we believe, are very important to incorporate into any alternative institution. Democracy, with democracy, an attempt to reach consensus, because consensus is much better than democracy. 50% plus one leaves a lot of people upset, but consensus leaves a lot of people happy. So we should try to promote consensus in whatever organization we're involved in. It's not always possible, but it should always be the goal, to get everybody on board and to move forward together. Equality, cooperation, kindness, and sustainability. There is a quote here about what's going on. I don't know if you've seen Al Gore's latest film, but obviously we are in a climate crisis, and unless we solve this really soon, we're going to have a world that will deteriorate right before our eyes. So I'd like to end by talking about 5 different areas of struggle or of activity that I think are important under this administration and going forward, because it won't end in 2020 when Donald Trump is out of office. We need to be incorporating these activities into our lives as we move forward, in my opinion, for the foreseeable future. So the first one, as you can see, is this resist. We need to struggle against oppression, and we need to build movements, try to link movements. The South Bay Progressive Alliance is actually pretty amazing, because on the steering committee that was first incorporated, we have people from 8 organizations. And so just by doing that, we have created linkages in terms of building movements together, because there's very, very few opportunities for movement people, and we've always been operating in silos. We all have our particular issue, but to actually be meeting in the same room and have 8 silos, working together, or 10 or 12 or 15, the steering committee is from 9 to 21 members, but assuming that we have, let's say, 15 members on a steering committee and they're all from different organizations, we're starting to work together in the South Bay Progressive Alliance. And that's a huge difference, because honestly, people don't talk to each other across silos ever. They don't have the opportunity. So I just realized recently that we're creating an opportunity to get out of silos by creating this South Bay Progressive Alliance. And so we do need to link our movements. If we can't link our movements, we're never going to be successful. The second one has to do with envisioning a new society, and I've talked a lot about that. But I do think we need a vision. If we don't have a vision to where we're going, we're not going to know how to get there. The third is what I already talked about, and that is we need to eco-humanize our structures and our institutions brick by brick. So we need to actually create new institutions, and to the extent that there are certain organizations, I think, that can be also eco-humanized that currently exist. When I was, right now I'm no longer the moderator for the local Santa Clara County affiliate of Move to Amend, that is seeking a 28th Amendment to the Constitution to get rid of corporate personhood and also to democratize our political structure, get big money out of politics. But in Move to Amend, for 5 years, we reached consensus on every single issue. And so to the extent that you can be part of an organization, and everybody here is part of an organization, to the extent that you can demand that organization to be democratic, and also try to reach consensus, to have consensus as a goal, I think that institution is an alternative institution, because you have created a governing structure that is extremely democratic. And that's the best we can get anywhere on planet Earth, if we can reach consensus in the organizations that we belong to. And so the fourth area is to democratize political power and then keep political power. And this is what the South Bay Progressive Alliance is trying to do. By the way, the South Bay Progressive Alliance includes Democrats, including the Santa Clara County Democratic Club, which is the biggest Democratic club in the Valley. And it includes, of course, groups like the Green Party. and DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and a lot of independents and other progressive organizations. So it is important to work together to build democratic power. And what's important is not whether you're a Green or a DSAer or a Democrat. What's important is beginning to create institutions that take these values seriously. And we're not taking these values seriously enough in our society today. So if we can elect candidates that truly will not take corporate contributions, and that's a requirement, and that truly will agree to meet with their constituents and be democratic going forward, and truly have progressive values around the values that we all care about, then we're making a change. It doesn't matter what the political affiliation is. What's important is that they are making a change in whatever office they're elected to. And then finally is to socialize the self, as Gandhi said, be the change you'd like to be. By the way, a local city council person, former Pierre Luigi, recently said that the statue in the City Hall of San Jose of Columbus demonstrates that civilization arrived to the Western Hemisphere. And it just reminded me of a very famous quote of Gandhi. He was asked the question, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And he said, "That would be a good idea." Good idea, but it's not reality. And so it really, in terms of socializing the self, we really have to be careful about burnout. So this question of reduced work hours and how we spend our time is critical for each one of us individually. Because unless we take the time for ourselves, we cannot be good for others. Unless we're healthy, we cannot be good to society. We cannot be good to our family, our community, or anything that we're involved in. So take care of yourself. It's really critical. But at the same time, do these other 4 things too. Struggle against oppression, envision a new society, eco-humanize our structures, and democratize political power. Thank you.
All right, if you have questions, raise your hand and I'll pass the mic around. First of all, turn your phones back on.
And I hope really, I want to hear comments more than give any kind of response, because I think what we really have to do is share. Yes.
When you started your presentation, you mentioned Jill Stein and the Green Party, and I think most of us in the room have seen the picture with Jill Stein and Flynn and Putin all sitting around the same table, and then you know that she ran a fake recount and raised, basically scammed $7 million from liberals. And then you mentioned, Hillary's, well, if only, if only Hillary hadn't, colluded with Donna Brazile to cheat, in the debates. If only the Democratic Party didn't rig the election. If only Bill Clinton hadn't met with the Attorney General to stop an investigation that, that she should have been investigated for. The Democrats just can't, become just slightly less corrupt than the Republicans and expect to win elections. And you can't have a Green Party where anybody who puts on a green T-shirt gets 20% of the liberal vote, And at some point, the Democrats and the liberals have to clean up their act, because they're not going to beat Republicans on corruption, and being slightly less corrupt than Donald Trump isn't good enough.
And I will take that as a comment, and let's move on. I agree with you.
This is probably small compared to the whole society, but it's an important one. I'm really concerned about in hospitals where you have the internship and residency, they have been abused. How do we change that? You're next.
I would not pretend to have an answer to that question. I think the professionals, which I am not one of, need to solve that question. I really can't give you a medical response to that question.
Thank you. I have only a brief comment regarding SB 562, which is California single-payer bill. It's not dead. It passed a Senate and it's put on hold
till next year.
This year, but this is 2-year bill.
Right.
And hopefully on next year, when all the gaps in this bill will be filled in, it may pass. Maybe not, but it's still alive.
And my understanding is that Rendon was acting on a number of problems. As you know, we had a local senator, John Vasconcellos, who I actually used to play racquetball with. And John Vasconcellos, many years ago, introduced a bill that requires 40% of the state budget to go towards public education, 40%. And so with SB 562, that imbalance is created. And that's a constitutional amendment. 40% must go to public education. So if somehow healthcare throws that 40% off, because a huge amount of money is coming into the state in a variety of different ways, including from employers, then there's a constitutional issue around that 40%. And so there are a number of issues, my understanding, that are being looked at to try to solve that problem.
Yeah.
I've just finished a long New Yorker article regarding Carl Icahn's butting up to Adolf Trump. Now, along with your talk here, I have just turned 94. I'm looking forward to kicking off and turning all the world's problems over to you young punks, if you don't mind.
I'm good with that. I wish I were a little younger myself.
Thank you so much for your talk. I agree with everything you said. I was wondering if the South Bay Progressive Alliance, using the DEX perspective, would categorize labor donations to a candidate the same as corporate donations.
That's a good question. And from the get-go in Richmond, labor donations were allowed. So a labor union is considered to be the sum of the workers and representing working class people and not representing corporate wealth. And so labor donations are allowed.
I'm very appreciative of your answer, because the one disagreement I had with your approach, with your talk, was you categorize all unions as if they were monolithic. And I would like to say that in the California University system, the California Faculty Association, which I'm a statewide officer, is fairly on par with the power of management. Not exactly, but closer than a lot of worker management situations.
No, I was part of the labor movement for about 15 years. I helped form a union, the California Federation of Teachers, Local 957, and I worked in the canneries, Del Monte Cannery, and I was part of TDU, Teamsters for Democratic Union, fighting, that bureaucracy inside the Teamsters at that time, which gave up the two-tier system. It allowed the two-tier system around that time frame. So there are a lot of unions that are run democratically, and frankly, there are a lot that are not. And so we really need to, once again, if we belong to any one of those unions, we need to try to create true democracy inside. Let me just tell you, when I started working in 1978 at Del Monte, 98% of the workforce was Spanish-speaking only. And the Teamsters union meetings were only in English. And so that's one thing we got changed. But it just gives you an example of it's all over the map in terms of unions. Yes?
You mentioned the negative consequence of NAFTA. because of U.S. subsidies for corn and the impact on Mexican corn farmers. I'm surprised. Doesn't the NAFTA agreement prevent subsidizing corn in one country?
No. No, it still allows subsidized crops in the United States. The Farm Bill, if you analyze the Farm Bill that is passed, what is it, every 5 years, I believe? The Farm Bill contains a plethora of subsidies.
No, I understand, but couldn't NAFTA be modified to
Well, of course.
prevent that?
And
I mean, there are
the
positive
current
benefits.
president has put out some preliminary ideas about changing NAFTA. And one thing that they would keep in there, Donald Trump's administration would keep in there, is the right of multinational corporations to sue governments. So multinational corporations would still be above governments in the revision that Trump is proposing.
Okay. One other comment, you mentioned people working long hours and foregoing their vacation. One interesting fact about that is that in federally funded operations like research laboratories at Stanford that I've been involved with, the government requires that every month you pay a salary to someone and you put aside a certain amount of money for their earned vacation that month. And then at the end of the fiscal year, if they are not taking the vacation, it's to the benefit of the laboratory to urge them to take vacation because their pay for that vacation month comes out of a different pot. And if it comes out of the normal operations budget, it's a consequence because that budget is running low. And the money that's in the vacation pot, I think, gets returned to the government if it's not used. And nobody wants to do that.
That's a better system than we have in most places.
She had her hand up.
Hi, can you please elaborate on your charts that you mentioned about get Democrats back in power? Are you referring to the Democratic Party there?
Yes, I'm talking about that level of reform. So I talk about respond, reform, or revolutionize. And so there's a lot of people that believe that if we can just get Democrats back in power, that everything will be resolved. And I disagree with that. I don't think that Democrats, getting back into power are going to solve the problems of this country. Because right now, I truly believe that the Democratic Party is controlled by corporate wealth. And as long as it's controlled at that level, and that was the barrier that Bernie ran up against, right? And as long as that's true, we're not going to see a real change in this country.
I just want to say that our president is a shame to this country, and I want to tell you a story. The devil came to see Trump, and he said, "Okay, Trump, I'll give you all the money and all the power you could ever want, but your wives, your children, and your grandchildren will burn in hell for eternity." And Trump thinks for a minute, and he says, "Well, that sounds good, but what's the catch?"
What's the catch? Anybody else?
Any other questions?
Well, I hope we don't see at the next election the liberal vote split. We've lost elections before because we had other people that looked really good like Bernie Trump, and we split the liberal vote and we lost the election. So we've got to work to pick somebody and really have everybody back them.
That's a good comment, and I will comment about that. And I think we've all probably expressed concern about, for example, whether Ralph Nader should have run in 2000 or not. Did he throw the vote to Bush? Yes. And did Gore therefore lose? And so, what is the role of a third party? And it is extremely complicated. I don't think anybody has the answer. But honestly, until there is a third party, which is probably not going to be the Green Party, until a third party reaches that 15% threshold, because right now the Republicans and the Democrats control the debate structure, the national debate structure at the time of presidential elections, and they require anybody to have received 15% of the vote to be on the stage. And that's why Jill Stein was not on the stage, and that's why other candidates were not on the stage. they're not allowed publicity. I heard something like Donald Trump got something like 1,200 minutes per 1 minute of Jill Stein during the election. So it was a huge imbalance in terms of exposure to people. And so I do believe that we need somebody with a significant amount of political force, like a Bernie, to create a third party. Personally, that's what I believe. I'm sure we all have our own opinions. But if we could create a third party that was capable, perhaps not of winning, obviously probably not winning, but at least getting 15% of the vote and having a viable third party option that the entire country going forward would change. I think we would, human beings would actually, Americans would have access to alternative information that they cannot access now, given our current debate structure, given the fact that the media is owned by corporations. And so we're not going to get any, honest debate at a national level that people will be listening to until we get an independent political party that can reach that threshold, because they could change that threshold too. So anything can happen, and it really is a long-term fight, because rules can change as we're trying to comply with the rules of the Democrats and the Republicans that require that 15% threshold. But on the other hand, if we truly had a non-Republican, non-Democratic Party alternative that incorporated the values that I talked about, I think people would follow.
And more Republicans would get elected.
So I just have a comment about what's a vacuum in the society. There is nobody who is looking at the society as a whole and to see whether the popular values that's adopted or promoted in the society are helping everybody. I give you an example. The popular value is taking care of yourself. But there are some people who cannot take care of themselves, and they need help. And they may be your friends. And you may think that, well, the government should take care of them. But the truth is, the government may not take care of them. And so it is just one example. And the churches or religious and non-religious organizations are promoting certain value like compassion and love and all this kind of thing. They are all good. But I think what we need more is more specific behavior norms, social contracts, how we should behave toward each other so that the good are rewarded and the not so good are not rewarded.
Exactly. And if I would probably end with one comment, although we may have a couple more, is that we need to operationalize love. We need to operationalize social justice. And that means that we have to get specific. And that means that we need to create institutions that truly incorporate our values. And we don't have hardly any of those in our society today.
Well, time's up for the questions. So let's give him one more big hand.
Thank you. Thank you all for being